Howdy gots! My name's Lavandula, and I make dark electronic music and synthpunk under the moniker Lavandula, and you're watching Dead DIY, a video essay series where I do deep dives into the history and culture of closed DIY music venues. If you don't know the difference between a DIY venue and a typical mainstream venue, DIY venues rely less on mainstream appeal and usually don't do bar sales, and they generally have a more experimental and eclectic variety of artists that they have come through. So these venues usually don't make a lot of money and typically exist just for the love of art in the underground arts community. And a lot of the time, DIY spaces are used for housing and events. And our landlords might not even know we're doing either. So when you're thinking of DIY venues, think house shows, warehouse raves, converted storage units. I know here in Tucson we had a rave and a wash recently, stuff like that. So yeah, now that we have a basic understanding of DIY venues, I'm gonna just jump right in. I'm talking about a space today that has had a major cultural impact on the DIY scene across the United States and likely other countries as well. Possibly the most major impact a DIY venue has had. It really brought our community to the mainstream, at least for a little bit. So yeah, if you didn't read the title of this video, I'm gonna be talking about the Ghost Ship Warehouse in Oakland. So yeah, Ghost Ship was a warehouse in Oakland, California that was being used as an artist creative space, a studio, affordable housing, as well as hosting events for the local underground arts community. Chor Ing purchased this warehouse in 1988 and rented it out to Derek Almina in 2013, who used the space to create Ghost Ship, to throw events, and to house artists, anywhere from 16 to 25 artists at any given time. Ghost Ship quickly became a pillar of the Oakland and Bay Area underground art and music community, as well as a home away from home for touring artists and musicians, and a home at home for artists and musicians. While this might sound utopian or romantic to some, Ghost Ship was definitely not without its problems. The building had known electrical problems dating back decades before Ghost Ship even moved in, and the previous tenant to Derek Almina actually removed their business and broke their lease due to neglect of maintenance. Derek Almina has been quoted saying that Chor Ing actually knew the building was unsafe when she rented it out to him. And Chor Ing has also said that Derek Almina knew that the space was unsafe when he rented it. The warehouse was connected to a transformer powering 2 other commercial spaces in addition to Ghost Ship. This caused frequent power outages along with other issues that I'll get into later on. A 2014 tenant was quoted saying that the entire electrical system was extension cords. And I'm sure some of us know all about that, don't we? Another tenant has said that when they lived there, power outages happened nearly every time that something was plugged in, which could be a lot considering, you know, there was a couple dozen artists living there. Living in a shared space with this many artists can be fulfilling, but it's usually not ideal. In this case, the first floor living spaces were connected by hallways made of scavenged materials, including random lumber, pianos, windows, organs, art projects, you know, stuff like that. And a lot of people living at Ghost Ship were thinking of the next place that they were gonna go. They didn't consider this to be a permanent housing situation, they considered it more of a temporary necessity. Despite its flaws, Ghost Ship made a name for itself in the Bay Area as well as nationally for being a highly creative space that hosted cutting-edge artists and provided a safe and exciting space for cultural outcasts and creative eclectics to get together and share experiences. Sorry, this is Oscar. Hey, Oscar. Oh. So what happened? How did such an important community space suddenly shut down after only 3 years? Well, on December 2nd, 2016, house music label 100% Silk was hosting a showcase when, at 11:20 p.m., a fire broke out. A small fire quickly grew into the deadliest fire in the history of Oakland. Of the 80 to 100 people attending the event, 36 of them were not able to survive the fire. When Max Orr, a jewelry maker and resident of Ghost Ship, saw the fire break out while he was working the door that night, he rushed to grab the nearest fire extinguisher. 2 other residents grabbed fire extinguishers as well, but the 3 of them were not able to put out the fire in time. It seemed as if immediately after the fire started, the flames exploded across the ceiling, devouring everything it touched. Piles of furniture and debris quickly collapsed, blocking exits, stairways, and hallways, making the space more difficult to navigate than it already was. The show was happening on the 2nd floor, above the living spaces, where it was most difficult to exit. Luckily, there were a few people that were able to escape the fire by crawling across the floor and using wooden pallets by the front staircase to get to the exit. Unfortunately, however, the heavy smoke and obstacles made it too difficult to survive long enough to escape the fire for about a third of the people attending. This tragedy was felt immediately in the Bay Area and sent shockwaves of grief across the nation and the world. I was living in Phoenix at the time, and I was a little too young to know anybody who had passed away. However, it seemed as though, all of my older friends in Phoenix knew somebody who had passed, and it was like my whole friend group and my whole underground community was suddenly grieving. At 11:20 that night, a rave was bringing a community together, and in under 10 minutes, that entire community felt that it had shattered. And what's worse is that 36 people had lost their lives, and those are 36 highly creative people that we will never get back. The exact cause of the fire is still unknown. However, many people believe that it was an electrical failure, and some people have said that it could have been arson. So this brings me to a question that a lot of people were immediately demanding an answer for. Who is to blame? As I'm sure you can imagine, this is a very complicated question. There are a lot of factors at play here, and I'm going to try to dissect this from every angle. But first, I'm going to start with the legal allegations. After the fire, Derek Almina, the master tenant, and Max Harris, who helped collect rent and helped throw shows, were both arrested and charged with 36 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Almina and Harris waited for their trial for 2 years in separate jail cells until April 2019, when, after 3 months of deliberation, Max Harris was acquitted on all counts and Derek Almina was sentenced to 1.5 years of supervised house arrest and credited with time served. Almina was found guilty in court because he had broken his lease by housing so many artists as well as throwing events, which had cluttered the space and left a lot of fuel for the fire. And honestly, if you look at pictures of the space before the fire broke out, it seemed like it was kind of inevitable. It seemed like it was not a fire-safe space, to be honest. And Harris was acquitted because the jury didn't believe that he played a big enough role in creating the environment that caused the fire. It's not surprising that the environment that Almina enabled was seen as irresponsible and dangerous. However, I don't think it's fair to place the blame just on him. You might remember some small details I talked about earlier, like how the entire electrical grid for 3 commercial spaces was powered by the same transformer, and how electrical issues dated back decades before Ghost Ship even moved in. One detail I haven't mentioned, however, and something that I found to be really interesting, is that this wasn't the first fire at that warehouse. In 2014, that dusty old transformer I mentioned actually ended up catching fire. And this was because, obviously, it was severely overloaded, as well as just regular maintenance that could have happened on it was just completely neglected. And the damage to the transformer with this fire would have caused immediate intervention to prevent future fires. And it seems like that didn't really happen, huh? After the 2014 fire, Derek Almina asked Chor Ing for $36,000 in reimbursement, and as we can all guess, she refused. The Ings, Chor and her son Kai, claimed that Derek Almina was responsible for the 2014 fire and said that he needed to restore the entire electrical grid without any reimbursement. I'm sure anyone who has rented a neglected space is familiar with this attitude from a property manager. An attitude that, remember, even the previous tenant was familiar with. They had removed their business because their maintenance requests were neglected. The Ings remained silent about this and avoided the media until 2020, when a class action lawsuit from the victims' families and the survivors forced her to speak up. Chor Ing claims that Benjamin Cannon, a tiny home business owner who did electrical work after the 2014 fire, is to blame. Cannon installed a new transformer at that time, sending Ing an invoice of about $32,000. In 2015, he sent another invoice calling for the repair of 2 breakers, as well as some other work. In that 2020 statement, Ing said that Benjamin Cannon was a fraud, claiming that he was a qualified electrician when in fact he was not. Ing says that he is to blame for the 2016 fire and the electrical issues. Gosh darn it, the ice cream truck's here. Like sunset in winter. So let's get into the details of that lawsuit. 80 plaintiffs filed this suit against the Ings, Benjamin Cannon, Derek Almina, PG&E, the electrical company, and the City of Oakland. In 2020, the City of Oakland settled their side of the case, paying victims' families $23.5 million and $9.2 million to Samuel Maxwell, who survived the fire but sustained lifelong injuries. PG&E's settlement was also finalized in 2020, but the exact amount is confidential. In 2021, the Ings filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy in order to pay the $11.8 million suit awarded to the victims' families. $4.8 million of that came from the sale of their properties, including the Ghost Ship warehouse, which had been left empty since 2016. The settlement awarded from Benjamin Cannon was $1 million. So that pretty much sums up the blame placed on individuals that were directly involved. However, when I was researching this, I couldn't help but notice that there's a bit of an elephant in the room. The housing crisis. So how do I put this? The housing crisis is inseparable from this event and inseparable from the DIY arts community in general. The DIY venue as artist housing phenomenon is not anything new, and it's more or less been used as a survival tactic among underground musicians since at least the early punk days of the 1960s and 70s, and likely even before that. As the cost of living continued to rise throughout the decades, I'm sure a lot of us know, unfortunately, that the minimum wage has not kept up, especially since the new millennium and the Great Recession of 2008. This has pushed impoverished artists further into the margins, making event venues that can also function as affordable living more and more common and increasingly necessary. And look, from personal experience, I'm happy with the space I live in now, but let me tell you, I have lived in some house venues, okay? Living in spaces like this that are pretty much packed with experimental artists and musicians, there's some pros to that for sure, but for the most part, it's usually not an ideal way to live. But whatever, experience is subjective, and maybe the experiences that I've had with this aren't the rule, but the exception. So let's talk numbers. In the 8 years prior to the fire, Oakland rents had increased about 70%, bringing the average cost for a monthly rental of a one-bedroom apartment to around $2,000 USD. And at the time of the fire, the minimum wage in Oakland was $12.55. And this means that if you worked 40 hours a week on minimum wage, by the end of the month, you would be spending more than 100% of your income on just rent. And that's just rent. That's not even counting utilities, food, bus fare, anything else. By subletting houses or warehouses to more people than the spaces are designed to house, artists can make rent affordable on low wages. And I mean, most of us don't get paid very much, and most of us are working other jobs in addition to our art, our career, just to be able to afford our basic needs. So situations like this literally keep people housed. In the case of Ghost Ship, renting out a commercial warehouse and subletting it to that many artists was able to provide those artists with rent from $300 to $600 a month, which at the time in Oakland was about 1/7 of the average cost of a one-bedroom apartment. And like I said before, many of the residents at Ghost Ship were only there, in their minds, temporarily, just doing their best to keep a roof over their head. And after the Ghost Ship fire, there was an increased crackdown on DIY venues in Oakland and across the nation, pushing many people out of their homes and in some cases removing their income. From 2017 to 2019, there was actually a 47% increase in homelessness in Oakland, which went from about 2,100 people to about 4,000 people. There are many factors that contribute to this, of course, with rent prices rising and minimum wage stagnating. However, in Oakland specifically, when I look at this, I think, could those DIY crackdowns possibly have had an impact on the number of homeless people in the city? I think it's definitely possible. Okay, well, let's back up a little bit. DIY crackdowns? What do I mean by that? And were there any other impacts that the fall of this venue had? Well, before I get into that, I want to take a minute to talk about the 36 people who lost their lives. Hey there. So I know I'm wearing a different shirt, don't get scared. When I was recording this before, the sun was setting, and this part is really important, so I want to make sure that I don't rush through it. So yeah, let's get into it. The first person I'm going to be talking about is Cash Askew, 22 years old. This is probably the person who affected me personally the most because I listen to their music and I love their band. They were a part of the goth duo Them Are Us Too, who makes beautiful, like, atmospheric darkwave music, and they also had 2 solo projects, Heavenly and Prist, in addition to being an active artist and DJ. Oh, and if you don't know who Them Are Us Too is, you should definitely check them out. Obviously, every link is going to be in the description, but, you know. And next up, we've got M. Bolka, 33 years old. They were a barista at Highwire Coffee Roasters, a writer and educator, and they grew up in Claremont, California. Jonathan Birnbaum, 34 years old. Jonathan was a VJ doing light shows internationally. They toured with Knife Party, an electronic band from Australia, you've probably heard of them, and they frequently worked with Ghost Ship. Their parents also made the Jonathan Birnbaum Memorial Fund. The Jonathan Birnbaum Memorial Fund is a fund that annually grants innovative Bay Area artists with money, as well as a second grant that goes to a student experimental filmmaker. Barrett Clark, 35 years old. Barrett was an audio engineer who was working at Ghost Ship the night of the fire. He was described as being a pillar of the Bay Area DIY scene for many years. He was in a band called Polar. He was a core member of the music collective Catabatic with Jonathan Birnbaum and Joey Cassio Matlock. David Klein, 24 years old. David was a UC Berkeley graduate, and he was known in high school for being smart, good at volleyball, and for playing clarinet in the school band. Micah Danemeyer, 28 years old. He was a curator and producer at Obscura Machina, which was an ongoing series of experimental music and video art. He was performing the night of the fire. He graduated from Massachusetts College of Art in 2011, and a scholarship fund for young artists was set up in his name at Massachusetts College of Art. He was part of the Dungeon Acid project of Red Cellar with David Saturnus. Billy Dixon, 35 years old. Billy was a musician, computer engineer, beatboxer, and DJ. He was described as a highly creative guitarist as well, and he had moved to Oakland in 2007. Chelsea Faith Dolan, 33 years old. Chelsea was a Marin radio host at KALX-FM. Chelsea also produced and DJ'd as Sharushi, and Chelsea was performing the night of the fire as part of the 100% Silk showcase. Alex Franz Gasson, 35 years old. Alex was a New Jersey native and an Oakland transplant. He was described as a brilliant cinematographer and director. He was also a freelance producer, and he had his twin daughters' names on his knuckles. Nick Gomez Hall, 25 years old. Nick was passionate about environmental issues, Black Lives Matter, civil rights, and loved to travel. He was an administrative assistant at Counterpoint Press. Michaela Gregory, 20 years old. Michaela was born in Redwood City, raised in San Bruno, and lived in San Francisco. Michaela loved electronic music and went to Ghost Ship to dance with their boyfriend Alex Vega the night of the fire. They were a former manager at Ulta and worked at Duggan Sarah Mortuary. Sarah Hoda, 30 years old. Sarah was a teacher at Urban Montessori Charter School. They started the art collective Music Box with Carol Crutzen, which was a space that housed up to 32 creatives at one time. Travis Hugh, 35 years old. Travis was a musician from Oakland and a member of the electronic group Ghost of Lightning. Travis was an expressive arts therapist at Montalvan Manor. Johnny Egos, 34 years old. Jonathan was an Oakland DJ known as Noct, a music analyst and a voiceover artist at Pandora, and recently became a music buyer at Green Apple. Ara Joe, 29 years old. Ara was an artist in residence at Berkeley City College, and they organized a zine fest called East Bay Alternative Book and Zine Fest. Ara was also a co-director of the Srafito Gallery. I'm not sure if I said that right. Donna Kellogg, 32 years old. Donna worked at Highwire Coffee Roasters and was an aspiring healer studying nutrition. Amanda Allen Kershaw, 34 years old. Amanda was a photographer at the center of the techno and house scene, and they loved to photograph DJs. They moved to San Francisco in 2008 with Andy Kershaw, who was a DJ, grew up in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, and graduated from Bridgewater State University in 2004. Edmund Lapine, 34 years old. Edmund was a former intern for K Records in Olympia. He studied at Evergreen State College and was passionate about music and climate justice. Griffin Madden, 23 years old. Griffin was devoted to theatrical arts at UC Berkeley and recently joined Cal Performances as a full-time audience services associate. Griffin majored in philosophy and Slavic languages and literature. Joey Cassio Matlock, 36 years old. Joey was a punk electronic musician, I know all about that, and was known for his unique and ephemeral style. He was a member of the collective Catabatic, which I already mentioned earlier. He was referred to as a philosopher of electronic music, and his sets incorporated nature and ambient sounds into what was described as a cathartic audio assault. Sounds pretty cool. Draven McGill, 17 years old. Draven was a child of Alameda County Deputy Phil McGill and studied choir at Ruth Asawa School of the Arts. Jason McCarthy, 36 years old. Jason was an alumnus of the San Francisco Art Institute, a sound technician and sound designer, and an artist and illustrator. Jennifer Mendiola, 35 years old. Jennifer was earning a PhD in psychology at UC Merced and was an aspiring psychology professor. Jennifer had 2 papers published, one in Preventative Medicine Reports and one in the Journal of Behavioral Medicine. Jennifer Morris, 21 years old. Jennifer Morris was a UC Berkeley student, played piano, guitar, and ukulele, and also sang. Jennifer was a painter and photographer as well. And Jennifer was described as having a deep sense of justice. Farrell Pines, 29 years old. Farrell was a bass player who recently moved to Oakland from Westport, Connecticut. They were also a hand poke artist and did tape art, like cassette tapes, I assume. Vanessa Plotkin, 21 years old. Vanessa was a UC Berkeley sociology student and volunteered at the campus radio station KALX, which I mentioned earlier. Michelle Colette Sylvan, 37 years old. Michelle was a clothing designer and massage therapist who loved to dance and would always come to events dressed up. Hannah Raux, 32 years old. Hannah was a jewelry artist who made jewelry out of recycled materials, a yoga teacher, and a Finnish, like Finland, activist. Hannah was in Oakland to visit her fiance, Alex Gasson. Ben Runnels, 32 years old. Ben was the introverted half of the synth-pop duo Intro Flirt and was a multi-instrumentalist who went by the name Charlie Prowler. Nicole Donalda Sechrist, 29 years old. Nicole was the flirt part of Intro Flirt. She was a synth player who did some very interactive performance art, who had been known to let crowds use her body as a canvas. Every show she performed at, she had friends design really intricate and distinct outfits, so she always had a fresh style at every show. She was known to use her weirdness as a strength. and was also involved in the Lincoln, Nebraska scene. She had a degree in textile clothing at UNL. Wolfgang Renner, 61 years old. Wolfgang was originally from Germany and was known as a fixture of the underground electronic community for decades. Jennifer Kiyomi Tenoye, 31 years old. Jennifer was a Shazam music manager and had set up a nail art booth on the second floor of Ghost Ship the night of the fire. Jennifer was also known as Invisible Pony. She worked at a store called Issues and expanded the East Bay Express Festival across the bay, helping to cement Oakland as an arts destination. Alex Vega, 22 years old. Alex was very stylish and wore lots of zippers, mesh, tinted glasses, and dressed up very elegant for events. Alex was into spray painting, fashion, design, photography, and electronic music. Peter Wadsworth, 38 years old. Peter was a Ghost Ship resident who was described as a creative genius. He studied psychology at Harvard and Reed College. He was one of the people who were trying to move out of Ghost Ship but was unfortunately unsuccessful. He had a marijuana-infused salsa company and created replicas of Egyptian sculptures. Nicholas Walrath, 31 years old. Nicholas was a lawyer at a small civil litigation firm. He had a bachelor's degree in physics and philosophy from MIT. The night of the fire, he had biked spontaneously 5 miles to get to the rave. And something really sweet but really sad, it really had me staring at the floor for a minute when I was researching this, is that before he passed away, the last text message he sent was to his girlfriend saying, "Fire, I love you." Brandon Chase Wittenauer. Brandon Chase Wittenauer, 32 years old. Brandon was a singer-guitarist at Symbiotics.Fungi, and he was known as uncommonly kind and curious about his peers. If you're not directly involved with the DIY music scene, it might be easy to overlook how deep of an impact this had pretty much immediately on artists and venues across the country and other parts of the world. The shock and tragedy of this event immediately brought DIY culture into the mainstream. And for many people, this was the first time they'd even heard of this subculture. Like, for example, a lot of our parents probably found out what we were doing from this. And this event caused a lot of people to panic when they first heard the news, thinking that DIY venues are like inherently dangerous, especially in the fire department and police force. And it definitely wasn't just Oakland. Cities across the United States and probably other countries as well immediately started shutting down venues for fear of fire. In some cases, this led to an increased difficulty in finding places to perform, as well as some people losing their homes and their income. And this left a lot of new venues to pick up the pieces, which greatly changed the infrastructure of the DIY scene. And definitely the DIY touring circuit in the United States as well. And of course, in Oakland, a drastic upheaval of the scene was taking place. Although this event did trigger a lot of venues and artist housing units to renovate their spaces to make them more fire safe, the Oakland Police and Fire Department were shutting down venues across the city with nothing more than a moment's notice. And this was in addition to landlords panicking and immediately evicting their tenants that they thought could have been throwing events. Castle Von Trapp, a 12-resident artist warehouse, and the Alina Museum, a West Oakland community art space dedicated to Afrofuturism, the African diaspora, and combating gentrification, were among a couple of the warehouses that were shut down immediately by landlords. In January 2017, Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf did actually issue an executive order telling code enforcement not to evict or shut down buildings with active residents. And to be honest, I was skeptical as to whether this was going to work or not, but the city did estimate that in 2017, around 4,500 people were prevented from being evicted due to this executive order. So that's pretty good, actually. So obviously, as we've talked about, this event sent tragic shockwaves across the entire community, but this event also shined a light on the importance of our community, which inspired many new people to get involved, creating new music venues, new artists, and a new wave of concert goers. Some important projects that were born in Oakland from this are Vital Arts, 30th and West, Oakland Warehouse Coalition, Safer DIY Spaces, and the Jonathan Birnbaum Memorial Fund. And just a couple of examples of organizations that were inspired by this across the United States. An Austin, Texas project Space was conceived, as well as the New York City Artists Coalition, which actually helped to end cabaret law recently, if you know what that is at all. It's a whole other video, but yeah. And of course, all these projects are going to be in the description, so you can check them out. All right, and that was the legacy of the Ghost Ship Warehouse in Oakland. I know I'm wearing yet another shirt, and my glasses have even changed. Just let it go. Just let it go. It's not worth it. All right? All right, it's fine. It's fine. He's honking. So yeah, it was really interesting to research this topic, and thank you for coming along for the journey. If you liked this video and thought it was interesting, go ahead and like, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what venues you think I should cover in the future. I'll be continuing to do research and video essays on this channel for other impactful DIY venues that have closed, just because I think these spaces are really special, and a lot of them have really improved my life for the better. And since I feel like I have this kind of connection, I'd like to help preserve their history. All of the projects I talked about will be linked in the description, and I'll throw in a link to my music and social media just in case you wanted to check that out too. Oh, and also I'll throw in a link to my Patreon. If you wanted to subscribe, that helps me to stay housed, to get groceries, and to continue making stuff like this. I hope y'all have a good day, make some friends, take a nap, play some video games, or just get some rest. Alright, gotta go. See you later.